Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Punitive Turn in American Life: How the United States Learned to Fight Crime Like a War, by Michael S. Sherry. Narrated by Rick Adamson. Publisher's Note: This audiobook refers to figures included in the print and ebook editions of the book. Introduction. Advertisements urging civilians to buy guns suggest how the punitive turn had played out by the 2010s. As close as you can get without enlisting, that is, get to war, stated one rifle ad, while another ad promoted a semi-automatic shotgun with the slogan, "Iraq, Afghanistan, your living room," and a handgun ad pictured an infantryman above the words, "Built for them, built for you." The message: Americans at home could carry the same weapons of war that soldiers carried in battle. Many Americans believed, or at least were asked to imagine, that the line between war fighting and crime fighting had almost disappeared. This book is about how that happened. The title of this work, The Punitive Turn in American Life: How the United States Learned to Fight Crime Like a War, captures the sweeping process starting in the 1960s that moved punishment and surveillance to the center of American life and imbued them with militarized language and practices. Its obvious forms were mass incarceration, as the United States became the world's foremost jailer, and the militarization of policing, as critics called it. But the punitive turn also encompassed other practices. Public schools entered through metal detectors and patrolled by police, gated communities shooing away the unwanted, cameras peering to catch red light offenders, armies of private police, familiar rituals of airport screening, and fads like the child spanking movement. Scholars often refer to the carceral state. The punitive turn in American life, a phrase I first used in 2005, signals a broader process that included what the state did, but went beyond it. The punitive turn faced countercurrents. It did not move forward inexorably and uniformly. As a result of authorities' indifference, court rulings, or legislative action, some acts once deemed criminal no longer were. Most abortions after Roe v. Wade in 1973, and sodomy between adults later on. Military conscription, certainly a coercive system and to some draftees a punitive one, ended in 1973, and the death penalty faced persistent and partially successful opposition. These countercurrents churned the waters, but did not halt the onrushing tide, at least until the 2010s. The punitive turn made America a meaner, punishment-obsessed nation, with vengeance at home and abroad its ruling impulse. And it made the United States a more distinctive nation, as it departed from norms in comparable countries. What caused the punitive turn in American life? Scholars, pundits, and, on occasion, politicians have offered many explanations, most centered on race, class, economics, and the state. This book seeks not to supplant those explanations, but to add to them, locating another engine driving the punitive turn: the nation's messy entanglement of war fighting with crime fighting. No great historical shift has a single cause, but a major cause of the punitive turn was the Vietnam-era crisis in the militarized order that had dominated the nation and disciplined its youth since the late 1930s. Under that order, the United States had harnessed industry, science, people, and propaganda to amass world-destroying weapons in its efforts to defeat Axis enemies in World War II, contain communism during the Cold War, justify an expansive state, and sustain its global hegemony. As the U.S. war in Vietnam faltered, that order frayed, and the state's legitimacy came into question. In response, political leaders embarked on a war on crime in order to reassert that legitimacy, to preserve their power, and to quell the era's disorder, starting a process whereby resources devoted to war and national security were partly redeployed to wage war on crime, to use the term that became commonplace. Redeployment was often halting, improvised, half-intended. But when President Lyndon Johnson proclaimed on September 22, 1965, that the policeman is the frontline soldier in our war against crime, the process was starting. By then, an already substantial apparatus of law enforcement and a powerful apparatus of national security allowed the state to act vigorously in criminal justice and to do so on militarized terms. Soon, the waning of America's war in Vietnam created a surplus of war-making capacity, people, institutions, machines, words, that was recycled into crime fighting. As the Vietnam War raged, responses to crime got encased in the language and institutions of war-making. Political leaders worked to rebuild a state under siege on the basis of a new punitive order, one that borrowed from an older militarized way of life. That process was hardly alone in causing the punitive turn, but it was consequential. It overlapped other sources of the punitive turn, and it was a causal force that Americans long overlooked. Over several decades, Johnson and others reconstructed the old militarized order and rebuilt the state on a new foundation of crime fighting. No one political faction, ideology, institution, leader, or vested interest made that project happen. Most Americans were complicit in it or oblivious to it, and those keen to resist were often powerless to do so. But all were not equally culpable. Political leaders and institutions, presidents, Congress, state legislatures, and so forth, bore the most culpability. Americans did not en masse demand the punitive turn. Leaders and institutions led them into it. Many Americans considered crime fighting to be like war fighting because of long-standing political habits and the immediate circumstances of the 1960s. Their nation had gone to war often, by some measures almost continuously. Americans had often regarded national problems as warranting a warlike response because war seemed like the mechanism that had most purposefully organized the nation and the state. President Franklin Roosevelt, for example, had cast the nation's response to the Great Depression as a warlike effort, saying at his first inaugural that he might need to respond as if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe, and the New Deal modeled some of its efforts on World War I's institutional apparatus. The bigger the wars, the stronger that habit in their wake. After World War I, and even more so after World War II, countless proposed national programs were analogized to wartime efforts like the atom bomb-building Manhattan Project or built on their apparatus. Less successful wars after 1945 complicated exercise of that habit without stopping it. But customs are not automatic. They intersect with circumstances. In the 1960s, they intersected with still powerful memories of World War II, with the war in Vietnam, and with rising racial conflict and crime at home. For President Johnson and many others, war, World War II in particular, provided the template for national action on many fronts. The language of war arose easily, almost reflexively, as these Americans confronted poverty, disease, social conflict, and crime. But the conditions of the 1960s, above all a floundering U.S. war in Southeast Asia, made that intersection especially fraught. The state slowly steered the institutions and modes of war toward crime fighting. But the era's analogies of crime fighting to war fighting were so numerous, conflicting, and explosive that the nation's punitive turn was, at its start, both energetic and uncertain. This book tells a story hardly unknown in its particulars, but hidden in plain sight overall. Many people know that war talk enveloped late 20th century campaigns against crime, especially in the war on drugs. But few scholars do more than note the presence of such talk, failing to map its emergence and tenacity, its twists and turns. As the punitive turn accelerated, apparent lines between spheres of action, war fighting and crime fighting, the military and the civilian, faded in political rhetoric and institutional practice. A robust and persistent language of war on crime enmeshed the two spheres. The blurring of lines encountered little opposition, even though shrill presidential rhetoric often revealed it, because war and crime tapped similar fears and ambitions, overlapped institutionally, and served similar purposes. To move from a war on foreign foes to a war on domestic ones did not seem like a big shift. Likewise, the phrase war on crime, often waged on those deemed criminals, seemed natural enough to Lyndon Johnson and the scores of others who came to use such phrasing. The narrative spine of this book is the public rhetoric and record of presidents and other high officials, but much branches out of it from that spine, since those officials hardly did it all. Unlike the most analogous realms, defense and foreign policy, for which authority was centralized, crime policy was scattered among many local, state, and national authorities. Even at the federal level, jurisdiction splintered among many agencies, and Congress and the courts played powerful roles. And initiatives often arose at the local level and in the marketplace with little or no presidential awareness. Yet presidents were hardly impotent. Indeed, one trajectory in the punitive turn was the ascending role of the presidency and the federal government in crime fighting. With the punitive turn, presidents from Lyndon Johnson on, Jimmy Carter was the exception, often set the tone and got their way. Dividing the story by presidencies is an old-fashioned way to write history, and many developments in the punitive turn spilled beyond the confines of any one administration, as listeners will hear. But that organization highlights what much scholarship neglects, the revealing role of presidents. Even when they were not prime movers, their words provided a major lens through which Americans understood criminal justice and punitive practice. And for presidents, crime was not just a national story, but a supercharged local one of crime and violence in Washington, D.C., right under their noses. Given that the federal government had jurisdiction over that city that it lacked elsewhere, these leaders could not ignore how the local intersected the national. Presidents' roles differed. Johnson's initiation of the punitive turn, Chapter 1 suggests, was caught up in the convulsive politics of war and race in the 1960s. His efforts featured the first sustained exposition of war on crime rhetoric, with policies roughly to match. Richard Nixon, Chapter 2 shows, echoed LBJ's rhetoric in a mean-spirited but less sustained fashion, and to less consequence than is often credited to him. Gerald Ford, Chapter 3 indicates, provided a robust ideological framework for a state rebuilt on crime fighting. However, he had little chance to implement that framework, and even less given resistance to the punitive turn by his successor, Jimmy Carter. Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, detailed in Chapter 4, offered a concerted, ugly, and consequential punitive conservatism, saturated with the words and mentalities of war fighting. Setting aside those words, Bill Clinton, Chapter 5 argues, offered a softer language of prevention that obscured the militarization of American criminal justice. Responding to the 9/11 attacks, George W. Bush, as Chapter 6 lays out, further exposed the currents of vengeance long coursing through the punitive turn. Pushed by many activist and legal forces, Barack Obama, Chapter 7 suggests, resisted the punitive turn, but did so cautiously and with limited success. Donald J. Trump, sketched in the epilogue, embraced the currents of vengeance viciously, even as he faced the strongest resistance to the punitive turn yet seen. These presidents and other leaders effected no conspiracy to enact a punitive turn, which is a story of unplanned and contingent shifts in political culture. Nonetheless, step by step, with a few steps backward, they helped to advance it. Most people believe that changes in punitive systems are driven by public attitudes, by the waxing and waning of fears of crime and tough-on-crime sentiments. Many crimes inflicted real horror and pain. The assassinations of John F. Kennedy in 1963 and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, the murder of 17 people in 1966 by ex-Marine Charles Whitman shooting from atop a tower at the University of Texas, and the Manson murders in 1969, as well as unparalleled urban violence, right-wing and left-wing terrorism, and much else. But the atrocity of crimes and the overall crime rate did not alone drive the punitive turn. Horrible lawlessness occurs in many eras without producing a large-scale punitive response. Who remembers the Bath, Michigan school bombing in 1927, which took 44 lives and may still be the deadliest school massacre in American history? Changes in criminal justice correlated loosely with public fears, and sometimes not at all, and public figures provoked fear of crime as much as they responded to it. What drove the punitive turn was not just the horror of law-breaking, but the responses to it of state authorities, politicians, the media, and others in a position to interpret the horror. Crime and fear of it were hardly the only forces at work. Critics and scholars have argued that the punitive turn was a project of racial control that replaced a system of overt racism with a nominally colorblind one of law and order. As Michelle Alexander explains, in the era of colorblindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. We have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it. This book connects that dimension of the punitive turn to other currents flowing through it. In America, criminal justice is always about race and never only about that. And law and order was not the only colorblind language. Apparently, the loud, sustained language of war was also colorblind, even as it carried thinly coded racial meanings, especially in the war on drugs. War is never just an abstract, neutral term for the clash of armies or nations. In the United States in the late 20th century, the word had cultural and racial valences. The nation's deadliest war, the Civil War, had been about race and had been waged in part by African Americans. Much of the nation's war-making had been against non-white enemies, and the term war on crime rose to prominence in the mid-1960s amid racial upheaval and at the peak of America's war against another non-white foe. Not everyone who bandied about such terms intended them to carry a racial charge, but the ostensibly race-neutral language of war also cloaked the racial assumptions and animus often undergirding the project of those supporting a war on crime. The language of war, like that of law and order, had a powerful undertow of racial meanings. This book is more about connections, associations, and feedback loops than causation, which is harder for historians to prove than many admit. The connections between war fighting and crime fighting were numerous, dense, charged, and ever-evolving. They helped drive the punitive turn and give it its character. These connections' persistence and ubiquity were as striking as their content. I trace the language of war that presidents, officials, police, arms peddlers, and others used. That language took many forms. Sometimes it involved a simple metaphor like war on drugs. Often it involved analogies and comparisons. For example, cops on the beat were like soldiers in war. And sometimes it was meant literally. In turn, that language propelled the use of warlike institutions and practices in crime fighting. Thus, language lay at the top of a slippery slope down to practice. Insofar as Americans saw fighting war as a model for fighting crime, not just as a breezy metaphor, their adoption of the war-fighting model implied a shrugging acceptance of the risks that combat entails, collateral damage to bystanders, danger to warriors as well as their targets, erosion of civil liberties and constitutional procedures, secrecy and deception, wasteful expenditures, abuse of enemies, distrust of those who resist the cause. Americans entered their war on crime having experienced such risks in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, and in the threat of nuclear war. They were accustomed to such dangers, in part because they fell heaviest on others beyond their shores. Risks like these were so woven into the fabric of Americans' historical experience that few questioned their reappearance in a war on crime. This was especially the case since the dangers of a war on crime were less obvious than those of a real war, creeping into consciousness and practice without the terrifying suddenness of Pearl Harbor or the 9/11 attacks. It was easy to analogize crime fighting to war fighting. Measured against the full run of American history, the punitive turn may seem less distinctive, only a new version of old patterns. After all, what was slavery if not a disciplinary system? And there was much else that fell into this category: the killing of Native Americans and their forced removal to reservations, the violent repression of workers by state and private authorities, the cruelties of Jim Crow and lynching for African Americans, with similar systems for Hispanic and Asian Americans, the mass repression during World War I of those deemed insufficiently loyal to the American cause, the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, the confinement of hundreds of thousands in mental health facilities. And that is only a short list. Was the United States a more punitive nation in 1990 than it had been in 1890 or 1790? Perhaps not. Yet even new versions of old patterns deserve explanation. In American history, punishment is ever present but hardly unvarying, and there was nothing in that earlier history quite like the rhetoric and practice of the war on crime late in the 20th century. Moreover, people usually understand their times in reference to a recent past, not a distant one. By that standard, the United States in 1990 was a much more punitive nation than it had been in 1950. This book is not a comprehensive history of the punitive turn, which was too vast and long-lasting for one study to encompass. Instead, this book offers a selective, sometimes idiosyncratic take on the words and practices that illustrate how war fighting and crime fighting intersected, crossed paths, collided, or more often blended together. Listeners will know other words and practices, especially regarding the high-tech dimensions of criminal justice, that I have neglected. By the same token, this book engages other scholarship selectively. For primary sources, it relies on published materials, some obvious and some obscure. At a few points, it digs into archival sources. Sections on cultural representations of criminals, victims, cops, and lawyers suggest how the punitive turn slowly spread into many facets of American life beyond the formal workings of criminal justice. This work is an exercise in the history of political culture, thus differing in methods, aims, and style from much scholarship in the social sciences and political history on mass incarceration, the carceral state, and other aspects of the punitive turn. By and large, this study does not refute that scholarship. It instead offers a complementary way to explain the punitive turn, one focused on the language, institutions, and politics of war. As such, the book is a provocation, designed to open a fresh way to think about the punitive turn rather than to offer the final say on it. The emotive dimension of the punitive turn, ugly demands for vengeance, kill the bitch in reference to Hillary Clinton during and after the 2016 presidential campaign, visceral hatreds, racist furies, indignant cries of injustice, is one I only partially account for. I do, however, show how presidents and others voiced that dimension, or gave others license to do so, and how that aspect of the punitive turn was often linked to the emotive thinking and language that war usually entails. Long living in the shadow of war, as I phrased it in an earlier book, Americans learned how to make substance of that shadow among themselves. As I write this, and you hear this, the punitive turn continues to spill forward and splatter its harm widely. It does not seem destined to end soon. Listeners will find it useful to understand how I use key words and phrases. I place the word war and phrases like war on crime and war on drugs in quotation marks when quoting the words of historical actors or when referring to the aforesaid phrases as metaphors and dominant terms. Otherwise, I use those words and phrases without quotation marks. Doing so risks appearing to normalize the phenomena involved, as if there were an actual war on crime, not a metaphorical one. But listeners will find out that is not my intent. Chapter 1. The Crisis of a Militarized Order, 1963 to 1969. Blame it on President Lyndon Johnson, among others. In 1965, LBJ declared war on crime, and in his usual way of making extravagant promises that often backfired, he pledged not only to reduce crime, but to banish it. He did much to start the punitive turn and to shape its nature. Because his crime-fighting efforts carried an aura of liberal social uplift and got lost in the sea of his many other initiatives and failures, they gained him little credit at the time from law and order types, little attention for a long time from scholars, and little blame from critics of American criminal justice. But his administration did help start the punitive turn in response to the Vietnam-era disruption of a militarized order, thereby enmeshing it in the attitudes and institutions of war. Johnson hardly intended to create the massive punitive system that soon emerged, a development so incremental that almost no one foresaw it, much less advocated it in the 1960s. But he was as instrumental in that development as law and order luminaries like Barry Goldwater, George Wallace, and Richard Nixon. True, LBJ sometimes disavowed responsibility. He had no choice but to sign the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968, he told Doris Kearns, explaining, "Nixon has forced me into it by all the election bullshit blaming the Democrats for crime in the streets." But his reluctance to sign that bill can be misleading. Johnson was a vigorous proponent of new crime-fighting efforts, and he saw crime as warranting war against it. In tying crime-fighting and war-fighting so closely, LBJ helped set the punitive turn in motion, redirecting the state from war abroad to war at home. Liberalism, at least some strands of it, was as responsible for the punitive turn as conservatism. Liberals had a deep association with war, not because they loved it, but because the mid-century peak of liberalism coincided with the mid-century peak of American war-making, which often underwrote the liberal state. They shared responsibility for the river of words, images, weapons, and personnel of war that flowed into crime-fighting. It is the place to begin this story. This chapter locates the start of the punitive turn in the embrace by Johnson and others of war's rhetoric and institutions, and in their ability to draw on the mid-century buildup of those institutions, which provided state capacity that could be turned to crime-fighting. As such, this chapter differs from other explanations of Johnson-era crime politics that seldom mention either that embrace or the Vietnam War context of crime politics in the 1960s and 1970s. LBJ and the Punitive Turn. The pressures within and beyond the Johnson administration to tackle crime were numerous, big, and volatile. Rising crime rates, as always more malleable and subjective than almost anyone admitted, and partly the product of more systematic reporting, were the most obvious concern. According to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, violent crime rose 11% from 1965 to 1966, and 165% between 1965 and 1975. In addition, the national homicide rate doubled between the mid-1960s and early 1970s, and soared even more in some big cities. Crime rates would have registered even higher had they reflected the illegal acts of racist Southern sheriffs and...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?